carriage wheel cracked against the stone bridge, and Eleanor Whitmore gripped the seat as the whole frame tilted hard to the left. Rain hammered the roof. Her father sat across from her, pale, saying nothing, though his hands trembled around a folded letter he had read 4 times since morning. She did not know yet that the letter held her future. She only knew that in 1 hour she would stand in front of a man she had never met and promise to be his wife. The manor rose out of the fog like something carved from ice. Gray stone, tall windows, no light in most of them, even though evening had not fully come. A row of servants stood at the entrance, silent, watching the carriage as it struggled up the muddy drive. Eleanor pressed her gloved hand against the window and studied the building, as if it might tell her something about the man who owned it. It told her nothing, except that whoever lived inside did not care for warmth. Her father cleared his throat. "Duke Ashcombe is a serious man," he said. "Do not expect conversation. Do not expect kindness at first. Expect patience to be required of you." "You make him sound like a punishment," Eleanor said, trying to smile. "I make him sound like a debt," her father answered. "Because that is what this marriage is. You know that." She did know it. Her father's business had failed twice in 3 years. The Ashcombe family held the papers that could either ruin him completely or forgive him entirely, and the difference between those 2 outcomes was her hand in marriage. She had agreed without complaint, not because she wanted to save her father, though she did, but because she had always believed that a life could be built out of almost anything, if 2 people were willing to try. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door, and cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet stone and old leaves. Eleanor stepped down and looked up at the entrance, where a tall figure stood waiting, unmoving, his coat dark against the gray stone behind him. Duke Sebastian Ashcombe did not step forward to greet her. He waited until she reached the top of the stairs before he spoke, and even then, his voice was flat, careful, like a man reciting a line he had memorized out of duty rather than feeling. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "you are welcome here." "Thank you, Your Grace." She offered a small curtsy. Up close, she could see he was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair combed back neatly, and eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. He was handsome in a way that seemed almost accidental, as though he had never once considered his own appearance and simply happened to look the way he did. He studied her for a moment, not rudely, but without warmth either, the way a man might study a document before signing it. Then he turned and walked into the house, expecting her to follow. The inside of Ashcombe Manor was even colder than the outside suggested. Long hallways stretched in every direction, lined with portraits of ancestors who all seemed to share the same serious expression. Fires burned in the main rooms, but the heat did not seem to travel far. Eleanor noticed there were no flowers anywhere, no color at all beyond the dark wood and darker stone. "Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your rooms," Sebastian said, already turning down a side corridor. "Dinner is at 8. I dine alone most evenings, but tonight, given the occasion, I will join you. I look forward to it," Eleanor said. He paused at that, glancing back at her, with something close to confusion, as though the phrase itself was unfamiliar to him. Then he nodded once and disappeared down the hall, his footsteps echoing, long after he was gone. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, was a broad, kind-faced woman, who talked as she walked, filling the silence Sebastian had left behind. "Don't mind his manner, miss," she said, leading Eleanor up a wide staircase. "He was not always like this. Losing the first Duchess changed him. Changed this whole house, if I'm honest." Eleanor's chest tightened. "I did not know he was married before." 3 years ago now, she passed very sudden. Fever took her in a matter of days. Mrs. Pemberton's voice softened. "He has not been the same since. Doesn't laugh. Doesn't linger anywhere. Works from morning until night, as though the work itself might fill the space she left." "That sounds like a very lonely way to live," Eleanor said quietly. "It is, miss. It is exactly that." They reached a large bedroom with tall windows overlooking the back gardens, which were as bare and neglected as the rest of the house. Eleanor set down her small bag and looked out at the gray grounds, the empty fountain, the hedges grown wild without anyone to shape them. She thought of what her father had said in the carriage. "Expect patience to be required of you." She had not understood then how much patience truly meant. Now, standing in this cold, quiet house, she began to understand that she had not just married a title or a debt. She had married a man who had built a wall around himself so thick that even grief could not escape it, let alone let anyone new inside. Dinner that evening was a formal, careful affair. The dining hall was long enough to seat 30 guests, though only 2 chairs were set at one end, close enough to speak, but distant enough that the space between them felt deliberate. Sebastian arrived precisely at 8, dressed simply, his expression unreadable. "I hope your journey was not too difficult," he said, taking his seat. "The bridge nearly took the wheel off," Eleanor said, trying for lightness. "I have never been so glad to see solid ground." "I will have the bridge inspected," he replied, missing the joke entirely, or perhaps choosing not to acknowledge it. They ate in near silence after that, the clink of silverware the only sound in the enormous room. Eleanor searched for questions that might open him even slightly. She asked about the house, about the land, about his work managing the estate. He answered each question directly, with facts, dates, numbers, but nothing that revealed anything about the man underneath the answers. Near the end of the meal, she tried once more. "Do you enjoy any of it? The estate? The work?" Sebastian paused, fork halfway to his plate, as if the question itself was strange to him. "Enjoyment is not something I consider," he said. "The estate must be managed. I manage it. Surely there is something you enjoy, somewhere you feel at ease." "No," he said simply, and returned to his meal. The word landed heavier than he seemed to intend, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face, something like discomfort, quickly hidden behind the same careful blankness he wore like armor. Eleanor did not push further. She had learned, in that single word, more about her new husband than an hour of conversation could have told her. He had built a life without joy in it, and he did not seem to notice the absence anymore. After dinner, he excused himself to his study, citing correspondence that could not wait. Eleanor stood alone in the enormous entrance hall, listening to his footsteps fade, and looked around at the portraits watching her from the walls, generations of Ashcombs who had likely faced the same cold silence she now faced. She could have wept. She considered it, briefly, standing there in her wedding clothes in a house that did not yet feel like home, and might never feel like one. But instead, she walked to the study door, hesitated only a moment, and knocked. "Enter," Sebastian said, sounding faintly surprised. He was seated at a large desk covered in papers, a single lamp casting light across his face. He looked up at her with an expression that was not unkind, simply unprepared for company. "I do not wish to disturb your work," Eleanor said. "I only wanted to say that I intend to make this a real home, if you will allow it. Not because I must, because I choose to." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, the lamplight flickering across his features. "You may do as you wish with the house," he said finally. "I will not stand in your way." It was not warmth. It was not even acknowledgement of what she had truly offered him, but it was permission, and Eleanor decided, standing there in the doorway of a cold man's cold study, that permission was a place to begin. She returned to her room that night and sat by the window for a long while, watching rain streak down the glass, thinking of the man downstairs who had built walls so high he could no longer see over them himself. She did not know yet how long it would take to reach him, or whether it was even possible. She only knew that she had made a promise that afternoon, in front of a priest and a handful of witnesses, and she intended to keep it, whatever it cost her. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows of Ashcombe Manor, and somewhere below, a single lamp still burned in the study, where a lonely duke sat surrounded by ledgers and silence, unaware that the woman upstairs had already decided to spend 2 years trying to bring him back to life. Morning came gray and quiet, much like everything else in the house. Eleanor rose early, before the rest of the household stirred, and walked the halls slowly, learning the shape of her new home. She found the library first, its shelves thick with dust, books untouched for what looked like years. She found a music room, with a piano no one played, its keys yellowed with age. Every room told the same story, a house built for a family that no longer gathered in it. She found Sebastian in the study again, though it was barely past dawn. He looked as though he had not slept, papers scattered across his desk, a cold cup of tea forgotten near his elbow. "You are awake early," he said, not looking up. "So are you," she replied, "or perhaps you never went to sleep at all." He did not answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. Eleanor stepped further into the room and picked up the cold cup of tea. "This will not do," she said. "You cannot work well on cold tea and no rest. I will have Mrs. Pemberton bring you something warm." "That is not necessary." "It is entirely necessary," Eleanor said, with more firmness than she expected from herself. "If I am to be your wife in truth, and not only in name, then allow me this much. Let me take care of small things, even if you will not let me near the larger ones yet." Sebastian looked up at her then, really looked, as though seeing her clearly for the first time since she had arrived. Something in his stony expression shifted, not into warmth exactly, but into something like curiosity, the first crack in a wall that had stood unchallenged for 3 long years. "As you wish," he said quietly. It was such a small thing, and yet Eleanor felt it like a victory. She left the study with the cold cup of tea in her hands, already planning the next small kindness she might offer a man who did not yet know how to receive them, determined that this cold house, and the cold heart inside it, would not remain cold forever. 3 months into the marriage, Eleanor had learned the rhythm of the house, the way a sailor learns the moods of the sea. She knew which floorboards creaked outside Sebastian's study, which hours he preferred silence, and which hours he could tolerate a knock at his door. She had not won his heart. She was not certain she had even won his attention in any lasting way. But she had learned him, piece by piece, the way one learns a difficult language, and she found she did not mind the effort. It began with the tea. Every morning, she brought it herself, instead of sending a maid, and every morning, Sebastian accepted it, with a short nod, sometimes a word of thanks, sometimes nothing at all. She learned he took it without sugar, strong, almost bitter, the way a man drinks something he does not enjoy but requires. She learned he preferred silence in the mornings, and would only speak once the second cup was finished. She learned his coat sleeves wore thin at the elbows from resting on his desk for hours at a stretch, and she began mending them herself in the evenings, sitting by the fire in her own room with needle and thread, though she had servants who could have done the task in half the time. There was something in doing it herself that felt important, though she could not have explained why to anyone who asked. She learned that he flinched, just slightly, whenever anyone mentioned his late wife by name, and so she stopped asking questions about the past, choosing instead to build toward a future he did not yet believe was possible. One evening in early autumn, Eleanor found him in the study long after midnight, the fire nearly dead, papers strewn as though he had fallen asleep mid-sentence, and startled awake again without noticing the hour. She did not scold him. She simply built the fire back up, moved a chair beside his desk, and sat with him in silence, not speaking, not demanding conversation, merely present. "You do not need to sit here," Sebastian said, not looking up from his ledger. "I know," Eleanor said. "I want to." He glanced at her sideways, something unreadable crossing his face. "Most people would find this dull. Most people are not married to you," she said with a small smile. "I find it interesting to watch a man solve problems. You frown at the numbers, as though they have personally wronged you." For a moment, something almost like amusement flickered at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared, but Eleanor saw it, and she carried the memory of it with her for days afterward, like a small warm coal held carefully in cupped hands. The estate itself was vast, and Sebastian managed nearly all of it himself, refusing help even when help was offered freely. Eleanor began to understand why. Work gave him a place to put his grief where it could not follow him into quiet moments. If he was always solving a problem, calculating a debt, inspecting a field, then he never had to sit still long enough to feel the absence that lived in every room of the house. She began, carefully, to insert herself into small corners of that work. She reviewed household accounts without being asked, catching an error in the kitchen expenses that saved a modest sum each month. She organized the neglected library, cataloging books that had sat untouched, and left small notes on ones she thought he might enjoy, tucked quietly onto his desk without comment. He noticed. He did not say much, but she saw him reading late one evening, one of the books she had left, and she said nothing about it, only smiled to herself and continued her quiet work of restoration, thread by thread, room by room. Not everyone approved of her efforts. Sebastian's aunt, Lady Margaret Ashcombe, visited in October and made her opinions known within an hour of arriving. She was a sharp-tongued woman, thin and precise, who had run the household in the years before Sebastian's marriage, and clearly resented being displaced. "You will not change him," Lady Margaret said over tea, her voice carrying the false sweetness of someone delivering an insult wrapped in politeness. "Better women than you have tried. His heart was buried with his first wife, and it is not coming back for a girl bought to settle a debt." Eleanor kept her composure, though the words stung more than she let show. "I am not trying to buy his heart, Lady Margaret. I am simply trying to be a good wife to a man who deserves one, regardless of whether he ever loves me for it." "How noble," Lady Margaret said dryly, "and how exhausting that must be." "It is not exhausting," Eleanor said quietly. "It is worth doing." She did not repeat the conversation to Sebastian, though she suspected Lady Margaret did, in her own way, deliver a version of it before she left. Something in his manner shifted afterward, not colder exactly, but more careful, as though he was watching her more closely, trying to determine her true motives. She found him one evening, standing at the window of the gallery, looking out at the darkening grounds, and she came to stand beside him without a word. "My aunt says you defend me to the family," he said finally, not turning to look at her. "I defend what is true," Eleanor said. "You are not the cruel, cold man some believe you to be. You are a grieving man who has forgotten how to be anything else. There is a difference, even if the two look similar from a distance." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. "Why do you bother?" he asked, and there was something raw in the question, something almost desperate beneath the careful control of his voice. "I have given you nothing, no affection, no warmth. You could resent me entirely, and no one would blame you." Eleanor considered her answer carefully before speaking. "Because I made a promise," she said, "and because I believe people are not fixed things. I believe a man who has forgotten how to feel joy can remember, given enough time and enough patience. I am simply choosing to be patient." He turned to look at her then, his gray eyes searching her face, as though trying to find the trick in her words, the hidden cost of such generosity. He found none, because there was none to find, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, like ice beginning to thin at the edges of a frozen lake. "You are a strange woman, Eleanor Whitmore," he said quietly. "Ashcombe now," she corrected gently, "and I will take strange as a compliment, if you meant it as one." "I did," he said, and for the first time since her arrival, something close to a real smile touched his face, brief and unpracticed, like a muscle remembering movement after long stillness. It was such a small thing, a smile that lasted only a moment, before he turned back to the window, and the darkening grounds beyond it. But Eleanor carried it with her up the stairs that night, and into her sleep, and she woke the next morning with a quiet, stubborn hope that had not been there before, a belief that the wall around Sebastian Ashcombe's heart, however thick, however old, was not without a door, if only she was patient enough to find it. Winter came early that year, and with it came long, dark evenings that Eleanor filled with quiet effort. She had the music room piano tuned, and began playing in the evenings, simple pieces at first, filling the cold halls with sound where there had only been silence before. She noticed, more than once, Sebastian pausing in the corridor outside, listening, though he never entered, and never mentioned it the next day. She had the gardens surveyed, and began planning what might be planted come spring, choosing flowers that would bloom, in colors the house desperately lacked. She spoke with Mrs. Pemberton about opening more rooms, airing out spaces that had been closed for years, slowly coaxing light back into corners that had forgotten what it felt like to be used. Sebastian said little about any of it, but Eleanor noticed small changes in him too. He came to dinner more regularly, no longer citing correspondence as an excuse to eat alone. He asked, once, what she thought of a particular tenant dispute, seeking her opinion rather than simply informing her of his decision. He began, in small and careful ways, to make room for her, in a life he had built entirely around the absence of anyone at all. It was not love. Eleanor was honest with herself about that. It was not even close to love, not yet. But it was a beginning, a slow thaw after a long freeze, and Eleanor told herself, as she had told Sebastian himself, that she was willing to be patient, for as long as patience was required, believing with her whole heart that the effort would be worth it in the end. The first year ended quietly, without celebration, though Eleanor marked the date privately in her own mind, counting the months the way a farmer counts seasons, watching for signs of growth that others might miss. Ashcombe Manor no longer looked like a house in mourning. Flowers had been planted along the front walk, though it was still too cold for them to bloom. The library had been fully catalogued, and Sebastian now visited it in the evenings, choosing books she had recommended, without acknowledging that she had recommended them at all. She had learned, by now, every corner of his moods. She knew the difference between the silence that meant he was thinking and the silence that meant he was remembering something painful. She knew when to speak and when to simply exist beside him, offering her presence without demanding anything in return. She had become, without either of them quite naming it, essential to the daily function of his life, though he had not yet allowed himself to acknowledge how much he had come to rely on her. It was Eleanor who noticed, before anyone else, the trouble brewing with the tenant farms along the eastern boundary of the estate. A dispute over water rights had simmered for months, ignored by the previous steward, and threatened now to boil over into something far more serious. She brought it to Sebastian's attention on a cold February morning, laying out the details with the same clear precision he used himself. "You have been reading my correspondence," Sebastian said, not quite an accusation, though his tone carried a note of surprise. "I have been reading the correspondence you leave open on your desk," Eleanor corrected. "And I noticed that Mr. Hargrove has written to you 3 times about the eastern boundary dispute, and each time, you have set the letter aside without response. The farmers there are growing desperate, Sebastian. Desperate men make poor decisions." He studied her for a long moment, and she braced herself for the familiar retreat, the polite dismissal that had followed nearly every attempt she made to involve herself in matters he considered his alone. Instead, he sighed, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "I have not had the time," he admitted. "Every hour is consumed by something else, and this seemed like a problem that could wait." "It cannot wait any longer," Eleanor said gently. "Let me help you. Not because I doubt your ability to manage it, but because 2 minds working together will solve it faster than 1 mind working alone." There was a long pause, and Eleanor wondered if she had pushed too far, reached for more than he was willing to give. But then Sebastian nodded, slowly, and slid the relevant papers across the desk toward her. "Tell me what you would do," he said. It was the first time he had truly asked for her opinion, rather than simply informing her of a decision already made, and Eleanor felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a warm cloak against the winter cold. She reviewed the papers carefully, asked several sharp questions about the water source and the original land grants, and by the end of the hour, they had drafted a compromise together that satisfied both feuding families, a solution neither of them could have reached quite so quickly alone. "You have a talent for this," Sebastian said afterward, something like genuine respect coloring his voice for the first time since her arrival. "I have a talent for listening," Eleanor said. "People tell you what they need if you simply pay attention long enough." He looked at her then, and something passed between them that had not been there before. A recognition, perhaps, that she was not merely a wife to be tolerated, but a partner capable of standing beside him in the actual work of his life, not just the domestic corners of it. From that day forward, small things began to change. Sebastian began discussing estate matters with her openly, seeking her counsel on decisions large and small. He began, too, to notice things about her in return. The way she hummed softly while working in the garden, the particular furrow of concentration that appeared on her brow when she read something troubling, the quiet strength she carried through every difficult conversation with tenants or relatives who doubted her place in the family. Spring arrived, and with it, the flowers Eleanor had planted the previous autumn finally bloomed, splashes of color against the gray stone that had not existed in the house for years. She found Sebastian standing before them one morning, simply looking, his expression unreadable, but softer than she had ever seen it. "They are beautiful," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They are stubborn," Eleanor replied, coming to stand beside him. "The soil here is poor, and the winter was hard. I was not certain they would survive. And yet they did," Sebastian said, glancing at her sideways with something that might have been meaning beyond the simple observation. "Some things are more resilient than they appear." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, uncertain if he meant the flowers or something else entirely, but she chose not to press the moment, letting it exist quietly between them. One more small brick in the foundation she had been building for over a year now, patient and steady, brick by brick, toward a wall that was slowly beginning to come down. Not every day carried such gentle progress. There were still evenings when Sebastian retreated entirely into himself, closing the study door and refusing even her quiet company, lost in memories she could not reach and did not try to force open. There were still moments when a careless word from a visiting relative would send him back behind his old walls for days at a time, undoing weeks of careful progress in a single afternoon. Eleanor learned to weather these retreats without taking them personally, understanding that grief did not move in straight lines, that healing looked less like a steady climb and more like a long, uneven path with switchbacks and false summits. She learned to give him space when space was needed, and to offer warmth again the moment he was ready to receive it, never forcing, never demanding, simply remaining steady and present through every turn. By the time the second spring approached, something fundamental had shifted in the house, even if neither of them had named it aloud. Sebastian sought her company more often than he avoided it. He asked her opinion before making decisions rather than after. He had, on more than one occasion now, actually laughed, a rare and startling sound in a house that had forgotten laughter for years, and each time it happened, Eleanor treasured it like a small miracle, evidence that her patience was not wasted, that the man beneath the ice was still there, still capable of warmth, still worth every ounce of effort she had poured into reaching him. She did not yet know that the very success of her patience would soon become the seed of its own undoing, that a man who had learned to lean on her without learning to thank her, who had grown accustomed to her devotion without ever truly earning it, was building a debt of gratitude he did not realize he owed, a debt that would eventually come due in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The fever came without warning, the way serious illness so often does, arriving on an ordinary Tuesday in late spring, when nothing in the morning had suggested that anything was wrong. Sebastian had complained only of a headache at breakfast, dismissing it as the result of too many late nights over the account books, and Eleanor had not pressed the matter, trusting his own judgment of his health as she trusted him in most things by then. By evening, he had not come down for dinner, and when Eleanor went to check on him, she found him in his bed, drenched in sweat, his skin burning to the touch, his eyes glassy and unfocused. She called for the physician immediately, her heart pounding with a fear she had not expected to feel so sharply, a fear that told her, in that single terrifying moment, exactly how much this cold, guarded man had come to matter to her. The physician arrived within the hour and delivered grim news. A fever of unknown origin, possibly connected to an infection from a small wound on his hand that Sebastian had ignored for days, now spreading through his blood with alarming speed. The next several days, the physician said gravely, would determine everything. Eleanor did not leave his bedside. She refused every offer of relief from the household staff, insisting on tending to him herself, changing the cool cloths on his burning forehead, coaxing water past his cracked lips, sitting through the long hours of the night listening to his labored breathing, and praying to a God she had not spoken to in years that he would be spared. Lady Margaret arrived on the second day, summoned by worried letters from the household, and found Eleanor exactly where she had been for nearly 2 days straight, exhausted, disheveled, refusing to rest. "You cannot save him through sheer stubbornness," Lady Margaret said, not unkindly, for perhaps the first time since Eleanor had known her. "You must rest, or you will fall ill yourself, and then who will nurse either of you?" "I cannot leave him," Eleanor said simply, and something in her voice must have convinced even the sharp-tongued Lady Margaret, because she said nothing further, only brought a chair and sat beside Eleanor through the long hours that followed, an unlikely companion in the vigil. On the third night, Sebastian's fever spiked to its highest point, and the physician warned that this would be the crisis, the moment that would determine whether he recovered or succumbed entirely. Eleanor held his hand through the worst of it, speaking to him softly even though he could not hear her, telling him about the flowers blooming in the garden, about a letter from a tenant thanking him for his fair handling of the water dispute, about anything and everything that might, in some small way, remind his body that there was a life worth fighting to return to. Somewhere near dawn, in the depths of his fever, Sebastian began to speak, his words slurred and disconnected, fragments of memory surfacing through the delirium. Eleanor leaned close, trying to understand, trying to soothe whatever distress was moving through him. "Charlotte," he murmured, his brow furrowed with pain, that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than the fever itself. "Charlotte, do not leave. Please, do not leave me alone in this house." Eleanor went very still. Charlotte. His first wife's name, spoken with a raw, desperate tenderness that Eleanor had never once heard directed at herself in over a year of careful, patient devotion. She sat holding his burning hand, listening to him plead with a ghost, and felt something crack quietly inside her own chest. A pain she had not expected and could not entirely explain even to herself. She told herself it meant nothing. A man in the grip of fever does not choose his words. He simply surfaces whatever lies buried deepest, and it was no surprise that Charlotte lay deepest in Sebastian's heart, given everything Mrs. Pemberton had told her on that very first day. Eleanor reminded herself of all of this, logically, carefully, and still the ache remained, quiet and persistent, settling into a corner of her heart, where it would stay far longer than she expected. By morning, the fever broke. The physician pronounced the crisis past, though full recovery would take weeks of careful rest. Eleanor finally allowed herself to sleep, collapsing into a chair beside the bed, exhaustion overtaking the fear that had kept her awake for 3 days straight. When Sebastian woke fully, 2 days later, he remembered almost nothing of the fever itself, only fragments of faces and voices moving through a haze of pain and confusion. He looked up to find Eleanor, asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still resting near his own, dark circles beneath her eyes, testifying to days without proper rest. "You stayed," he said, his voice hoarse, when she finally woke and found him watching her. "Of course I stayed," Eleanor said, straightening in the chair, forcing warmth back into her voice, despite the ache still lodged in her chest. "Where else would I have been?" "Many wives would have left it to the servants," Sebastian said quietly. "Many wives, in a marriage such as ours, would not have felt obligated to sit through 3 days and nights at a sickbed." "I am not many wives," Eleanor said. "I am yours." Something moved across his face at that. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more complicated. A recognition, perhaps, of the depth of what she had given him, freely, without demand, for a second year running now. And yet, even in that moment of vulnerability, even fresh from the edge of death itself, he did not ask what she had heard him say in his fever. He did not reach for her hand and hold it the way she had held his through the long, terrifying nights. He simply thanked her, briefly, formally, and turned his attention to the pile of correspondence that had accumulated during his illness, already retreating back into the safety of work and duty. Eleanor left the room quietly, telling herself that a man recovering from serious illness could not be expected to manage complicated emotions on top of physical recovery. That patience, once again, was required. That she had weathered worse retreats than this one and come through the other side with her hope intact. But alone in her own room that evening, she allowed herself, finally, to weep, not from exhaustion alone, though exhaustion played its part, but from the quiet, private grief of loving a man who, even at the edge of death, had called out for someone else, and who, upon waking, had thanked her for her devotion, without once acknowledging what that devotion had actually cost her, or asking what it might mean. She did not tell him what she had heard. She told herself there was no purpose in it, that raising Charlotte's name would only reopen a wound in him that had only just begun, in small and fragile ways, to heal. But the name stayed with her, a small stone she carried quietly in her pocket, and though she continued every act of care and attention exactly as before, something in her had shifted too, a first, faint crack appearing in her own patient devotion, though she did not yet recognize it for what it was. The following weeks passed in careful routine as Sebastian regained his strength. Eleanor continued to nurse him, to manage the estate correspondence in his stead, to sit with him through long afternoons of enforced rest that he clearly found maddening. He grew steadily more like himself, sharp-witted, focused, capable, and as he recovered, Eleanor watched him slowly retreat back into the same careful distance he had always kept, the brief vulnerability of illness sealing itself back over with the same old armor, as though the fever had never touched him at all. She said nothing of her disappointment. She continued to bring his tea each morning, to mend his coats in the evening, to defend him against Lady Margaret's occasional sharp remarks, but somewhere inside her, quietly, a small voice had begun to ask a question she had never allowed herself to ask before. How much longer could she keep giving before she needed something given back in return? She did not yet have an answer. She only knew that the question, once asked, however quietly, did not disappear, and would return to her again and again in the months that followed, growing louder each time, until she could no longer pretend not to hear it. Summer settled over Ashcombe Manor with a heaviness that matched the mood Eleanor could not quite shake, though she tried, in every visible way, to appear as devoted and steady as she always had. Sebastian recovered his full health within a month, and with that recovery came a swift return to his old habits: long hours in the study, brief conversations at dinner, a formal politeness that had become, over the past year, so familiar that Eleanor sometimes forgot it had ever been any different. She had expected the illness to change something between them permanently, had allowed herself to hope, in the depths of those 3 terrible nights at his bedside, that surviving such a crisis together might finally break through the careful distance he maintained, even in his gratitude. Instead, within weeks, it seemed almost as though the illness had never happened at all, filed away by Sebastian as an unfortunate interruption to his work, rather than a moment that had revealed anything meaningful about the state of his heart. Eleanor did not confront him about this. She was not certain, even now, what exactly she would say if she did. That she had heard him call out for a dead woman while she sat holding his fevered hand? That his simple, formal thanks upon waking had felt like a door closing rather than opening? These were not accusations easily spoken aloud, not without sounding petty or jealous of a woman who could no longer defend herself, and Eleanor had too much pride and too much genuine sympathy for Sebastian's grief to become the kind of wife who resented a ghost. Instead, she continued as she always had, bringing his tea, managing correspondence, sitting with him in comfortable silence during the rare evenings he allowed her company in the study. But something in the rhythm of her devotion had changed subtly, a quality of watching, rather than simply giving, an awareness that had not existed before, of exactly how much she offered, and exactly how little, in comparison, came back to her. It was during this quiet, uncertain summer that Eleanor first began to notice how much the household had come to depend on her, without anyone quite acknowledging it. Mrs. Pemberton brought household decisions to her, rather than to Sebastian, who had never involved himself in domestic matters even before his illness. The tenant farmers, having come to trust her fair judgment during the water dispute, now sent letters addressed to her directly, rather than to the Duke himself. Even Lady Margaret, on her occasional visits, had begun speaking to Eleanor as an equal, rather than an intruder, a grudging respect earned through 2 years of steady, uncomplaining competence. Sebastian noticed none of this, or if he noticed, he said nothing, accepting the smooth function of his household and estate as simply the natural order of things, the way a man accepts good weather, without pausing to consider the complex systems that produce it. Eleanor had become, in every practical sense, indispensable to the running of his life, and yet she remained, in the ways that mattered most to her own heart, a stranger, standing just outside the door of his affections, close enough to hear the fire crackling within, but never quite invited to sit beside it. One evening in July, a distant cousin of Sebastian's, a cheerful, talkative young man named Edward Barlow, visited the estate on his way to London, and stayed for several days. Edward was everything Sebastian was not: warm, curious, quick to laugh, genuinely interested in Eleanor's opinions on subjects ranging from poetry to politics. He complimented her freely, listened attentively, and made no secret of finding her excellent company. Eleanor enjoyed his visit more than she expected to, not from any romantic interest, for her heart, however neglected, remained stubbornly loyal to the cold man she had married, but simply from the novel experience of being seen, of having her words received with genuine interest, rather than polite, distracted acknowledgement. She found herself laughing more in those few days than she had in months, and she noticed, though she did not comment on it, that Sebastian seemed to notice as well. He said nothing directly, but his manner grew subtly sharper during Edward's visit, his silences at dinner carrying a different weight than usual, less distant and more charged, as though something beneath his careful composure had been disturbed. On the final evening of Edward's stay, after the young man had retired for the night, Sebastian found Eleanor, alone in the gallery, looking out at the darkened gardens. "My cousin seems quite taken with you," he said, his tone carefully neutral, though something beneath it suggested the neutrality was costing him effort to maintain. He is a pleasant conversationalist, Eleanor said simply. It has been enjoyable to talk with someone who asks questions and actually listens to the answers. The words came out sharper than she intended, and she saw them land, saw something flicker across Sebastian's face, not quite hurt, but close to it, a recognition perhaps of the implicit criticism buried in her comparison. I am aware that I am not a man given to easy conversation, Sebastian said stiffly. I did not say that to wound you, Eleanor said, softening slightly, though the truth of her frustration remained. I only meant that it has been pleasant, for a few days, to feel genuinely heard. And you do not feel heard by me, Sebastian said. It was not quite a question. Eleanor hesitated, weighing honesty against the familiar instinct to protect him from any discomfort, an instinct she had maintained faithfully for 2 years now. But something in her, tired and a little raw from the summer's quiet disappointments, chose honesty instead. Sometimes I wonder if you notice me at all, beyond what I do for this house and this family, she said quietly. I have given 2 years to learning every corner of your moods, Sebastian. I nursed you through a fever that nearly took your life. I have never once asked for anything in return, because I believed, and still wish to believe, that patience would eventually be rewarded. But patience is not the same as invisibility, and some days, I confess, I do not know the difference between the two in this house. Sebastian was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor braced herself for the familiar retreat, the polite deflection that usually followed any attempt to name the distance between them directly. Instead, he surprised her. I do notice you, he said, his voice low, almost strained, as though the admission cost him something significant to make. I notice you every day, Eleanor. I simply do not know how to say so, in a way that does not feel foreign to me. I have spent 3 years building a version of myself that feels nothing, because feeling nothing was easier than feeling the full weight of what I lost. I do not know how to unbuild that, even when I wish to. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly, a small measure of the ache she had carried since his fever finding some relief in the admission. But even as hope flickered, she recognized, too, the limits of what he had offered. He had explained his coldness. He had not promised to change it. He had named the wall without offering any timeline for tearing it down. Then let me help you unbuild it, Eleanor said softly, slowly, if that is what it requires. But do not leave me standing outside a door you refuse to even try opening. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment, something raw and uncertain moving behind his gray eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, Eleanor saw something that looked almost like fear in his expression, the fear of a man standing at the edge of vulnerability he had avoided for so long that he had forgotten the way back to it. I will try, he said finally, quietly. I cannot promise how well I will manage it, but I will try. It was not everything Eleanor wanted. It was, perhaps, not even close to everything she deserved, after 2 years of steady, uncomplaining devotion. But it was more than he had ever offered before, and Eleanor, ever patient, ever hopeful, chose to hold on to it as evidence that her efforts had not been entirely in vain, unaware that the true test of his promise still lay ahead, and that the coming months would ask far more of both of them than either could yet imagine. For a while, after that conversation in the gallery, something did shift, though slowly, and in ways so small that Eleanor sometimes wondered if she was imagining the change simply because she wanted so badly to see it. Sebastian began asking her opinion, not only on estate matters, but on smaller things too, which wine to serve at dinner, whether a particular tenant's request seemed reasonable, what she thought of a new arrangement of furniture in the drawing room. Small questions, but they were questions that assumed her presence mattered beyond the practical function she served, and Eleanor treasured each one. He began, too, to sit with her more often in the evenings, not always speaking, but present in a way that felt different from before, less like a man tolerating obligation, and more like a man choosing, deliberately, to remain in a room he could easily have left. Once, in September, he read aloud to her from a book she had left on his desk, his voice low and steady in the quiet drawing room, and Eleanor sat with her needlework forgotten in her lap, listening not so much to the words as to the simple, remarkable fact of his voice, filling a silence he usually guarded so carefully. But the promise he had made in the gallery, to try, proved harder to keep than either of them anticipated. Grief, Eleanor was learning, did not release its grip simply because a man decided, in a single honest moment, that he wished it would. There were still evenings when Sebastian retreated entirely, closing himself in the study for hours without explanation, emerging distant and short-tempered, offering no account of what had triggered the withdrawal. There were still anniversaries, quiet dates that meant nothing to Eleanor but everything to him, when he grew silent and unreachable, and she learned to recognize these days by the particular hollow look in his eyes, rather than by any calendar she could consult. She weathered each retreat as she always had, with patience, with quiet presence, never demanding explanation, trusting that the progress they had made would eventually reassert itself once the difficult moment passed. And it usually did, though each cycle of retreat and return seemed to take a small toll on her own reserves, a toll she did not fully register until she found herself, one evening in late autumn, crying quietly in her own room, for no reason she could immediately name, simply exhausted by the sustained effort of loving a man who gave affection so sparingly and inconsistently. She did not mention these private moments of weariness to anyone, not even to Mrs. Pemberton, who had become something of a confidant over the 2 years of Eleanor's marriage. She told herself it was simply the natural rhythm of loving someone complicated, that all marriages required effort, that hers was perhaps only more visible in its difficulty than most, but no less worth the struggle for that visibility. The second anniversary of their wedding arrived in early winter, marked by no particular celebration, since Sebastian had never been one for marking dates even before his first wife's death, and Eleanor had learned not to expect grand gestures from a man who struggled even with small ones. She mentioned the date quietly at breakfast, more from habit than expectation, and Sebastian looked up from his correspondence with an expression of mild surprise. "Has it truly been 2 years?" he asked. 2 years, Eleanor confirmed. Almost to the day. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider this fact with more weight than she expected. "You have given a great deal in that time," he said finally. "More, I think, than I have properly acknowledged." It was, perhaps, the closest thing to a genuine tribute he had ever offered her, and Eleanor felt a small, cautious warmth kindle in her chest at the words. "I have given what I chose to give," she said. "I do not regret it." "And yet," Sebastian said slowly, "I wonder sometimes if you should. Regret it, I mean. I have not been the husband you deserved these past 2 years, Eleanor. I know this. I have simply not known how to be anything different." "You have tried," Eleanor said gently. "These past months, I have seen you try. That matters to me, even when the trying is imperfect." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving across his features, gratitude tangled with something that looked almost like guilt, and Eleanor wondered, not for the first time, exactly how much weight he carried silently regarding his own limitations, how much he judged himself for failing to give more freely what she offered so easily. "I will do better," he said quietly, the same promise he had made months before in the gallery, though this time it carried the weight of 2 years' accumulated evidence, both of his genuine effort and its persistent shortfalls. Eleanor wanted, desperately, to believe him completely. Some part of her did believe him, trusted the sincerity behind the words even as she recognized the pattern of promise followed by partial fulfillment, followed by retreat, that had characterized their entire marriage. But another part of her, quieter and more tired than she wanted to admit, had begun to wonder how many times a person could hear the same promise, before the promise itself lost its power to comfort. She said nothing of this quieter doubt. She simply nodded, accepted his words, as she had accepted every previous version of them, and continued the daily work of loving a man who seemed, in his own halting way, to be trying his best, even when his best remained frustratingly inconsistent. Winter deepened, bringing with it a particularly harsh season of estate difficulties, a poor harvest that strained the tenant farms, a dispute with a neighboring landowner over boundary lines that required weeks of careful negotiation, an outbreak of illness among the estate workers that demanded constant attention and care. Sebastian threw himself into managing each crisis with his usual intensity, and Eleanor, as she always had, supported him at every turn, managing correspondence, visiting sick tenants with baskets of food and medicine, smoothing tensions between feuding neighbors with the same quiet diplomacy she had shown from the very beginning of their marriage. Through it all, Sebastian relied on her more heavily than ever before, seeking her counsel at every turn, trusting her judgment implicitly, treating her, in the practical function of daily crisis management, as an equal partner, rather than a distant wife. And yet, even in the depths of this shared labor, even as they worked side by side through weeks of genuine crisis, he offered little in the way of personal warmth, little acknowledgement of the toll the constant work took on her own well-being, little recognition that a woman who had given so much of herself to his family's survival might need, occasionally, to be cared for in return, rather than simply relied upon. Eleanor began, quietly, to feel the particular exhaustion of being needed, without being cherished, of being essential, without being treasured, a distinction that grew sharper in her mind, with each passing week of the difficult winter. She did not stop giving. She did not know, yet, how to stop, having built her entire approach to this marriage around the belief that sustained devotion would eventually be met with equal devotion in return. But something in her had begun, almost imperceptibly, to keep count, to notice the imbalance more consciously than she had allowed herself to notice it before, and that quiet counting, once begun, proved impossible to fully set aside. The turning point, when it finally arrived, came not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a single evening, so ordinary that Eleanor would later marvel at how such a small moment could carry so much weight. It was late February, the worst of the winter crises finally behind them, the estate settling back into its usual routine. Sebastian had been working late for several nights running, reviewing accounts related to the harvest losses, and Eleanor had noticed, with growing concern, the deep shadows beneath his eyes, and the tightness in his shoulders, that suggested he was pushing himself far past reasonable limits. She brought him tea that evening, as she always did, and found him hunched over his desk, rubbing his temples with the particular weariness of a man who had not properly rested in days. "You should sleep," she said gently, setting the tea beside him. "The accounts will still be here in the morning. You cannot solve every problem through sheer exhaustion." "I do not have the luxury of rest right now," Sebastian said, not looking up. His voice clipped in a way that suggested irritation rather than simple fatigue. "The harvest losses must be accounted for before the quarterly review, and I cannot trust anyone else to manage the figures correctly." "I could review them with you," Eleanor offered. "Two sets of eyes might find the solution faster, and you might actually sleep tonight." "I do not need help with this, Eleanor," Sebastian said, and something in his tone, sharper than usual, carried an edge of dismissal that landed harder than perhaps he intended. "I am capable of managing my own estate without constant intervention." The words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor felt something inside her go very still, a stillness that was different from her usual patient acceptance of his difficult moods. She had offered help, genuine help, born of 2 years of demonstrated competence in exactly these matters, and he had dismissed it, not with simple refusal, but with something that bordered on rebuke, as though her offer itself had been an overstep rather than an act of care. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice or demand an apology, though some part of her recognized, even in that moment, that an apology might well have been warranted. She simply said, "As you wish," in a voice that gave away nothing of what she felt, and left the study quietly, closing the door behind her with careful, deliberate softness. But something had shifted in her, something that did not announce itself with drama or tears, but settled instead like a quiet decision made somewhere beneath conscious thought. She had spent 2 years offering herself entirely, adapting to his moods, anticipating his needs, absorbing his sharp edges without complaint, believing all the while that consistency would eventually be rewarded with equal consistency in return. That night, for reasons she could not entirely articulate even to herself, something in her simply stopped believing it. She did not decide, consciously, to change her behavior. She did not plan any particular strategy of withdrawal or punishment. She simply found, in the days that followed, that the effort of anticipating his needs felt heavier than it once had, that the impulse to bring him tea each morning arrived a little slower, that the words of comfort she usually offered so readily came less easily to her tongue. She still performed her duties as Duchess, with the same outward competence she always had. She still managed the household, still corresponded with tenants, still appeared at dinner with proper composure, but the small, voluntary kindnesses that had characterized her devotion for 2 years, the mended coats, the carefully chosen books left on his desk, the quiet presence offered simply for its own sake rather than out of obligation, these began, one by one, to fade. Sebastian did not notice immediately. He was too consumed by the quarterly accounts, too accustomed to her steady presence in the background of his life, to register the subtle absence of her usual attentiveness. Eleanor still brought his tea each morning, because the household routine demanded it, but she stopped lingering afterward, stopped asking how he had slept, stopped offering the small observations about his mood that had once opened quiet conversations between them. A week passed this way, then two, and Eleanor found, to her own quiet surprise, that the absence of effort brought with it an unexpected lightness, as though she had been carrying a weight for so long that she had forgotten its actual heaviness until she finally set part of it down. She did not stop loving him, not entirely, not in any way she could have named clearly even to herself, but she stopped, deliberately or not, performing that love in the countless small ways she once had, and the difference, though subtle, began to reshape the quiet rhythm of the house. She began spending more time in the garden, tending to the flowers she had planted years before, finding a satisfaction in the work that asked nothing of her except her own attention. She began reading in the evenings for her own pleasure, rather than selecting books for Sebastian's desk. She began, in small ways, redirecting the considerable energy she had spent for 2 years entirely on his behalf back toward herself, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not miss the exhaustion of constant giving nearly as much as she expected to. Lady Margaret, visiting again in early March, noticed the change immediately, with the sharp perception of a woman who had spent years watching the currents of this particular household. "You seem different," she observed, over tea in the drawing room, lighter, somehow, though I cannot quite say why. "Perhaps I am simply tired," Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized they were not quite true. She was not tired, in the way she had been during the difficult winter crises. She was, if anything, less tired than she had been in months, and the recognition of that fact unsettled her slightly, as though she had stumbled onto a truth she was not yet ready to examine directly. Tired of what, exactly? Lady Margaret pressed, with the same directness that had once made Eleanor bristle but now, after 2 years of gradual acquaintance, felt more like genuine concern than hostility. Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "Tired, perhaps, of being the only one who tries," she said finally, quietly. "I do not say this with bitterness, Lady Margaret. Only with honesty. I have given a great deal to this marriage. I am not certain, any more, how much longer I can give, without receiving something in return." Lady Margaret was silent for a long moment, studying Eleanor with an expression that had softened considerably from the sharp skepticism of their first meeting 2 years before. "My nephew is a fool," she said finally, "if he does not recognize what he risks losing. But he is also, I think, a man capable of change, if given the proper motivation to change. Sometimes, my dear, a man does not learn to value warmth until he feels its absence directly." The words settled into Eleanor's mind and stayed there, turning over slowly in the weeks that followed, as she continued her quiet withdrawal from the countless small acts of devotion that had once defined her daily life at Ashcombe Manor. She did not know, yet, whether this withdrawal was a deliberate strategy or simply an honest exhaustion finally asserting itself after 2 years of suppression. She only knew that something fundamental had shifted within her, and that shift, once begun, could not easily be undone, regardless of what Sebastian might eventually notice, or how he might eventually respond to the absence of a devotion he had, for 2 years, taken almost entirely for granted. It took Sebastian nearly a month to notice, fully, the change that had settled over his household, and when he finally did notice, it arrived not as a single sharp realization, but as an accumulation of small absences that had gradually built into something impossible to ignore. He noticed, first, that his tea in the mornings arrived without the small pleasantries that had once accompanied it, that Eleanor no longer lingered at his desk, asking about his plans for the day, or offering quiet observations about the household. He noticed, next, that the books that had once appeared mysteriously on his desk, chosen with such careful attention to his interests, had stopped appearing altogether. He noticed, too, though it took him longer to name the absence directly, that the empty chair beside his desk, where Eleanor had once sat in comfortable silence during long evenings of work, remained consistently empty now, that she no longer sought his company in the study, no longer waited up for him when his work ran late into the night. At first, he told himself this was simply a passing mood, the natural ebb of a marriage that had weathered 2 difficult years, and that her usual warmth would return in time, as it always had after his own periodic withdrawals into grief and distance. He had, after all, retreated from her countless times over the past 2 years, and she had always been there, patient and steady, when he finally emerged from those retreats. He assumed, without examining the assumption too closely, that her current distance operated on the same principle, a temporary weariness that would resolve itself given sufficient time. But the weeks passed, and Eleanor's distance did not resolve. If anything, it settled more firmly into place, a quiet, consistent composure that replaced the warm attentiveness he had grown so accustomed to, that he had stopped consciously registering it as something offered rather than simply owed. She continued to manage the household with perfect competence, continued to appear at dinner with proper conversation, continued to fulfill every visible duty of a duchess with unimpeachable grace. But something essential had gone quiet beneath the surface of her behavior, and Sebastian found himself, for the first time in their marriage, genuinely unsettled by an absence he could not immediately name or address. He found himself watching her more closely during this period, noticing details he had previously overlooked entirely. He noticed the particular way she had begun spending her afternoons in the garden, absorbed in work that clearly brought her satisfaction independent of anything connected to him. He noticed that she read now for her own pleasure, choosing books that interested her rather than books she thought might interest him. He noticed, with a discomfort he did not fully understand, that she seemed, in some fundamental way, more content than she had been in months, and that her contentment appeared to exist entirely separate from any consideration of his own moods or needs. This last observation troubled him more than he expected. He had grown accustomed, over 2 years, to being the emotional center of his own household, the sun around which Eleanor's attention naturally orbited, and the discovery that she had found satisfaction independent of that orbit unsettled something in him that he had not previously recognized as fragile. He tried, in his own awkward way, to re-establish the old rhythm. He asked, one evening, if she would care to join him in the study, a request that would once have brought immediate, warm acceptance. Eleanor considered the request for a moment before answering. "I have letters to finish this evening," she said, her tone perfectly pleasant, entirely without accusation, and yet the simple, straightforward refusal landed with an unexpected weight. Perhaps another evening. He found himself, in the days that followed, manufacturing small opportunities to draw her back into the patterns of their previous life together, asking her opinion on estate matters he could easily have decided alone, commenting on books he thought might interest her, lingering at breakfast longer than his usual schedule allowed. Eleanor met each of these overtures with pleasant, competent engagement, answering his questions thoughtfully, discussing the books with genuine interest, but always with a certain measured quality that had not existed before, a warmth offered carefully, rather than given freely. It was, Sebastian realized slowly, exactly the kind of careful distance he himself had maintained for the first year of their marriage, the polite functionality of 2 people sharing a household without the deeper investment of genuine intimacy. The realization struck him with unexpected force. He had spent 2 years slowly, imperfectly, learning to receive the warmth Eleanor offered so freely, and now, just as he had begun to grow genuinely comfortable within that warmth, it had quietly withdrawn, leaving him standing in exactly the kind of cold, formal marriage he had once considered entirely sufficient, before he understood what he was missing. He mentioned his concern, cautiously, to Lady Margaret during her next visit, uncertain how to name the strange unease that had settled over him in recent weeks. "Eleanor seems different," he said, choosing his words carefully. "More distant, somehow. Though I cannot say she has done anything I could reasonably object to." Lady Margaret regarded her nephew with an expression that mixed sympathy with something sharper, a kind of exasperated fondness that had characterized her opinion of him for years. "Perhaps," she said dryly, "you might consider asking her directly, rather than describing the symptoms to me as though I were a physician diagnosing an illness." "I do not know how to ask," Sebastian admitted, and the admission, quiet and genuine, surprised even himself with its honesty. "I do not know what I would even be asking about. She has done nothing wrong. She simply seems elsewhere, even when she is standing directly in front of me." "Perhaps," Lady Margaret said, more gently now, "you might consider that a woman can only give so much for so long, without receiving anything meaningful in return, before she begins, quite reasonably, to protect what remains of her own heart. Eleanor has given you 2 years of devotion, Sebastian. More patience and care than most women would have offered under far kinder circumstances. If she has finally begun to withdraw some portion of that devotion, I would suggest the fault lies rather more with what you failed to offer in return than with anything she has done wrong herself. The words settled into Sebastian with uncomfortable weight, and in the days that followed, he found himself turning them over repeatedly, examining his own conduct over the past 2 years with a scrutiny he had never previously applied to himself. He thought of the fever, of the fragments Eleanor had never mentioned, but which he sometimes suspected. In his more honest moments, he had spoken aloud during his delirium. He thought of the evening he had dismissed her offer of help with sharp, unwarranted irritation. He thought of countless small moments across 2 years when she had offered warmth, and he had accepted it as simply his due, without ever pausing to wonder what such consistent generosity might eventually cost the woman offering it. He began, slowly and with considerable discomfort, to understand that he had built an entire marriage on the assumption that Eleanor's devotion was a permanent, unshakable feature of his household, as reliable and unremarkable as the changing of seasons, and that assumption, he now recognized with growing unease, had perhaps been the single greatest failure of his marriage, a failure that might already have cost him something he had only just begun to realize he could not afford to lose. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived on an evening in early April, the gardens outside beginning to bloom again, with the same stubborn flowers Eleanor had planted years before, a small, persistent reminder of the effort she had poured into this house since the very first day of her arrival. Sebastian found her in the library, sitting alone by the window, reading with the same quiet contentment he had noticed and struggled to understand for the past several weeks. "May I speak with you?" he asked, and something in his voice, uncertain in a way that was uncharacteristic of him, made Eleanor look up with genuine curiosity. "Of course," she said, setting her book aside and giving him her full attention, the same composed graciousness she had maintained throughout the weeks of her quiet withdrawal. Sebastian stood for a moment, seeming to search for words, and Eleanor waited, patient as she had always been, though something in her had changed enough now that the patience felt different, less like hope and more like simple, calm observation. "I have noticed," he said finally, "that you have changed toward me these past weeks. I do not say this as an accusation. I have simply noticed, and I find that I do not know how to account for it, or how to properly ask what has caused it." Eleanor considered her answer carefully before speaking, aware that this moment, however it unfolded, would likely determine a great deal about the shape their marriage would take going forward. "I have given you 2 years, Sebastian," she said quietly. 2 years of patience, of devotion, of trying, in every way I knew how, to reach past the walls you built after Charlotte's death. I do not regret that effort. I would make the same choices again, given the chance. But somewhere along the way, I began to notice that the giving had become entirely one-directional, that I anticipated your needs while you rarely paused to consider mine, that I nursed you through a fever during which you called for another woman's name, and that you thanked me afterward, as though gratitude alone could settle what such devotion actually cost. Sebastian's face went pale at the mention of the fever, and Eleanor realized, watching him, that he had indeed suspected, all along, what he might have said during those delirious nights, though he had never before had confirmation. "I did not know," he said, his voice low, "that you had heard that." "I heard it," Eleanor confirmed, "and I said nothing, because I understood grief does not follow logic, and I did not wish to burden you with guilt over words spoken while you were not fully yourself. But I have carried that moment quietly ever since, Sebastian, alongside every other small moment when I gave freely and received, in return, only distance or distraction, or the assumption that my devotion was simply owed to you, rather than freely chosen. Eventually, a person runs out of the particular kind of patience required to keep giving under those conditions. I did not decide, consciously, to withdraw from you. I simply found, one evening, that I no longer had the strength to keep anticipating your needs, while my own went entirely unconsidered, and once I stopped, I discovered I did not particularly wish to start again. The words landed with visible force, and Sebastian stood silent for a long moment, absorbing what she had said. his careful composure cracking in ways Eleanor had rarely witnessed across the entire span of their marriage. "I do not know how to properly apologize for what I have failed to give you," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed to be struggling, genuinely, to master. "I have spent 3 years building a version of myself that felt nothing, because feeling nothing seemed safer than facing what I had lost. And then you arrived, patient and warm, in ways I did not deserve, and certainly did not properly appreciate, and I simply accepted it, the way one accepts sunlight or rain, without ever considering that such warmth required actual effort on your part. Effort that I did nothing to earn or reciprocate." "No," Eleanor agreed quietly, "you did not." "I am asking you now," Sebastian said, "though I recognize I have no right to ask anything of you after 2 years of taking your devotion for granted, to allow me the chance to earn back what I have clearly lost. Not through grand gestures, which I suspect would mean little, given how consistently I have failed to offer smaller ones, but through the same patient, daily effort you once offered me, if you are willing to allow me the opportunity to try." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, this man she had loved quietly and patiently for 2 years, watching the genuine vulnerability in his expression, so different from the careful blankness he had worn on the day of their wedding. She recognized, in this moment, that something had genuinely shifted in him, that her withdrawal, painful as it had been to enact, had accomplished something that 2 years of patient devotion alone had not quite managed. It had forced him to see clearly, perhaps for the first time, exactly what he stood to lose. "I am willing to allow you the chance," she said finally, "but I will not return to the woman I was before, Sebastian. I will not anticipate your every need while setting aside my own. I will not give without expectation of receiving something in return. If you wish to rebuild what exists between us, it must be built on different terms than before, terms where my own heart matters as much as yours, where my own needs are considered as carefully as I have always considered yours." "Those are fair terms," Sebastian said, "and they are terms I intend to honor, though I ask your patience as I learn how." It was not a complete resolution, not yet, not the sweeping declaration of transformed love that might satisfy a simpler story, but it was honest, and it was a genuine beginning, built this time on mutual acknowledgement rather than one-sided sacrifice. And Eleanor, watching Sebastian's face in the soft evening light of the library, allowed herself, cautiously, to hope once again, though this time her hope carried within it a new and hard-won clarity about exactly what she deserved, and exactly what she would no longer accept less than. The months that followed tested Sebastian's promise in ways that neither of them had anticipated, and Eleanor watched, with cautious attention, as he began the slow, uneven work of unlearning 3 years of careful emotional distance. He did not transform overnight, and Eleanor had not expected him to. There were still evenings when he retreated into silence without explanation, still moments when old habits reasserted themselves and he forgot, briefly, to ask how her day had passed before launching into his own concerns. But something fundamental had changed in the effort itself, a visible, deliberate quality to his attempts that had not existed before the confrontation in the library. He began, for the first time in their marriage, asking her directly what she needed, rather than assuming her needs would simply align with whatever the household required of her. He began noticing when she seemed tired, offering to take on tasks she had long managed alone, without acknowledgement. He began, in small and sometimes clumsy ways, expressing gratitude, not just for what she did, but for who she was, complimenting her judgment, her patience, her particular way of finding calm solutions to difficult problems. One evening in early summer, nearly 3 months after their conversation in the library, Sebastian found Eleanor in the garden, tending to the flowers that had bloomed so persistently across the past 2 years, despite the poor soil and harsh winters. He sat beside her without being asked, an act that would once have seemed impossible for a man who rarely lingered anywhere without explicit purpose. "I have been thinking," he said, "about Charlotte." Eleanor set down her gardening tools and gave him her full attention, recognizing the significance of him raising the subject, unprompted for the first time in their entire marriage. "I loved her," Sebastian continued, his voice steady but careful. "And I do not think that love simply disappears because she is gone, nor do I think it should. But I have realized, these past months, that I allowed my grief for her to become an excuse for failing to properly love you. as though honoring one required neglecting the other. That was never a fair arrangement, Eleanor, and it was certainly never one you agreed to when you married me. I did not expect you to stop loving her, Eleanor said gently. I only ever asked that there be room for both, that her memory not require my own erasure. There is room, Sebastian said, taking her hand, an act of simple physical warmth that would have seemed remarkable even 6 months before. I am only now learning how to make that room properly, rather than simply closing myself off entirely and calling it grief. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a tightness she had carried for so long that its release felt almost unfamiliar, and she allowed herself, finally, to believe that the changes of recent months represented something lasting, rather than a temporary correction born of fear of losing her entirely. The following autumn, nearly 3 years after their wedding, the estate hosted a modest harvest celebration, the first genuine gathering the household had held since before Charlotte's death, according to Mrs. Pemberton, who wept openly with happiness at the sight of the manor filled with light and music and laughter after so many years of quiet mourning. Sebastian danced with Eleanor that evening, clumsily, for he had never been a graceful dancer, but with genuine warmth that drew the attention of relatives and tenants alike, a visible transformation from the cold, distant Duke they had known for years. Lady Margaret watched from the edge of the room, a rare smile softening her usually sharp features. I did not think I would live to see this house filled with such warmth again, she said quietly to Eleanor, when the dance had ended and Eleanor came to rest beside her. You have accomplished something remarkable, my dear, though I suspect the credit belongs equally to your own courage in finally demanding better, as it does to your years of patience before that. Both were necessary, Eleanor said, watching Sebastian across the room, laughing genuinely at something Edward Barlow had said, a sound that still, even now, struck her as a small miracle each time she heard it. Patience opened the door, but it was the courage to step back, to demand something better, that finally taught him to walk through it properly. That night, after the guests had departed and the house had settled back into quiet, Sebastian found Eleanor in their bedroom, sitting by the window as she often did, watching the last of the season's flowers sway gently in the autumn wind below. 3 years ago, he said, coming to sit beside her, I stood at the top of those stairs and greeted a stranger I had been told to marry, and I felt nothing but the weight of duty. I did not know, then, that the woman standing before me would spend 2 years teaching me how to feel again, only to teach me, in the final and perhaps most important lesson, that feeling required more of me than simply receiving what she offered so freely. And what have you learned, in the months since? Eleanor asked softly. That love given without expectation of return is a gift, Sebastian said, but that a marriage built entirely on one person's gift, without the other person learning to give in equal measure, is not truly a partnership at all, only a slow, patient kind of loneliness, dressed in the appearance of companionship. I do not wish for us to be that any longer, Eleanor. I wish for us to be equals, giving and receiving in equal measure, for whatever years remain to us. Eleanor turned to look at him, this man who had once seemed made entirely of ice and duty, now sitting before her with genuine vulnerability in his gray eyes, and she felt, for the first time since the fever had revealed the depth of his old grief, a complete and settled confidence in the foundation they had built together, not through her patience alone, nor through her eventual withdrawal alone, but through the difficult, honest combination of both, and his willingness, finally, to meet her halfway. Then let us be exactly that, she said, taking his hand in the quiet darkness of their room. Equals, for whatever years remain to us. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the flowers she had planted so many seasons before, the same stubborn blooms that had survived poor soil and harsh winters to flourish, despite every difficulty. Much like the marriage that had grown, slowly and imperfectly, in the cold halls of Ashcombe Manor, transformed at last from a house of quiet mourning into a home built on hard-won understanding, patient devotion, and the equal partnership of two people who had each, in their own difficult way, learned exactly what love required of them, and had finally, together, chosen to give it.